And welcome to the fifth and last speaker of the 2022 Speaker Series sponsored by the Oregon Episcopal Diocese Working Group on Racial Justice. I am Madeline Moore, and I am a member of the leadership team of the working group. And this evening's program really promises to be quite inspirational and educational. And before we get into introducing Dr. Linda Tamura, I wanted to mention a few things. First of all, how grateful we are to Derek Moyer, who is behind the Wizard of Oz screen that says Diocese of Oregon. Derek is the Missioner for Lifelong Formation at the diocese, and it also has been tremendous help to us technically. Also, we'll be using the chat for if you have questions and answers, but not actually for chatting amongst each other. If you have something private that you want to say to someone, you can chat with them privately, but not for public chatting. But if you as you have questions, we will get to those towards the end of the evening. All right, so Dr. Linda Tamura, who's asked us to call her Linda, is Professor Emerita of Willamette University. She is the granddaughter of Japanese immigrants and was raised on an orchard in Hood River. She's also the author of several publications, including 2 books, Nisei Soldiers Break Their Silence and Hood River Issei. Both of these books use Linda's thorough research along with numerous oral history interviews of Japanese Americans in Hood River from the early 1900s through World War II and beyond, really. Our own Bishop Akiyama, who is unable to be with us tonight, has called Linda a treasure of the Japanese American community in Oregon. And tonight, we're going to hear about her research, as well as her current activism with the Japanese American community in Hood River. And I know you're going to find Linda to be a delightful speaker and full of information. So let's get started. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Good. And we are thrilled to have you here. And I should say that Linda is actually traveling right now. So she's greeting us from a hotel room in Phoenix. And I know that before we get started on hearing about your work, we wanted to start off with some definitions and terms.
Sure. And Derek, do you have that image? Fab. Let me see the next one. That's great. So if you were counting in Japanese, 1 and 2 would be ichi and ni. And so Ichisei would be the first generation of Japanese, or Issei, and they were those who were born in Japan, immigrated to the United States at the turn of the century or shortly afterward, and they were my grandparents' generation. You know, they came, they ended up doing menial work, and then were incarcerated during the war. They were not citizens, and they spoke. Most of them spoke only Japanese language. So that would be the Ichisei or the Issei, the first generation. The second generation are the Nisei, two generation. They're the children of the Issei. My parents' generation, they were born in this country as American citizens, but during World War II, they were also considered perhaps unpatriotic and were incarcerated during the war. So from Ichi and Ni, we have Issei and Nisei, and now you know a little bit of Japanese.
Thank you. So we ask all of our speakers, Linda, to talk about what has called you to your work that you do. Would you mind sharing a few thoughts about that?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really insightful question. Um, I think for me, it was not knowing. Um, I There was a time in my life when I was a young adult when all of a sudden everything I thought I understood about me, my family, my community, and my country was all askew. And I still remember the pit in my stomach when I discovered some new information. I'll give you the big picture. In many cases, it was, as a teacher, we would say it was an aha moment. All of a sudden, the ground caved. I had a lot of questions. I was compelled to find the answer, and I needed to know more. I had discovered a community secret, something that my family, the Japanese American community, my teachers in school didn't talk about it, and certainly not my community. And when I asked my mom about it, in fact, she turned to me and said, "Do you want to start World War III?" In other words, be careful about asking that question because it could get you into trouble. But I was a young adult and I really needed to know more. And so to make it a short answer, I would say simply what called me to do my work, it was needing to know. It was wanting to understand more about my heritage, my community, and what in the world happened to create such a havoc that in fact brought national notoriety to my hometown.
Right. I think you told me a little bit about your elementary school experience, or do you have is there a photo of you in
Yeah.
elementary school? Derek, is that
There
one the next? Yeah,
there goes that. Yeah.
okay.
And that actually goes back to my roots. I was the only Japanese American at my elementary school, Pine Grove Grade School in Hood River, until my sister joined me 2 years later. And to be honest, grade school was, I didn't feel any different. I thought I was just an all-American kid. Although lunchtime was really an experience. And I think when I came home from school, my first words to mom about school were about what I'd had for lunch, because I had my first hominy and cornbread, pizza, tacos. The cook made me stay in after lunch because I could not eat the rice pudding, but I'd never had rice pudding or rice that was sweet. So that was really an experience. I do know that mom told me that after the first day of school, I came home and complained. I said, "Mom, there's nobody there at school for me to marry." And I guess even in first grade, I was on the prowl. And somehow I guess I thought I was supposed to marry someone who looked like my dad, and there was nobody there who looked Japanese American. So first grade was quite an experience, as well as not seeing anybody in my books who looked like me. That was telling. It wasn't actually until I was a young adult, and you can go to the next picture, when my uncle suggested that I ask questions of my grandmother. He told me that grandma had really lived a very interesting life. He said she was a picture bride who was born in Hiroshima, and she came to the United States and married your grandfather, worked on an orchard, raised 4 kids. And you really would learn a lot by asking her questions. So with my mom's translation, because grandma only spoke Japanese, I began asking grandma questions. And after one interview, I was amazed, but also grandma said she was done. She would not talk to me anymore about her life. And when I said, "Well, did I do anything wrong?" She said, "Well, now, if if I were Eleanor Roosevelt, now there's somebody who would really be able to answer your questions and tell stories, but I'm just a poor old woman. So I've not done anything significant, and there's nothing else that I want to tell you about my life. That was distressing to me, but after a year, my uncle convinced her, and I began to learn more about the Issei, their immigration, their early settlement, and then about World War II. And at that time, there weren't a lot of documents. There were very few books about Japanese Americans. And even the museum had a 2.5-page handout on Japanese Americans, but it stopped at World War II. So I went to the county library and sat in the basement and went through the yellowed newspaper articles from early 1900s through World War II. And that's when I found an article that totally amazed me. Derek, I'll let you move on to the next one. That's the article, and I still recall the pit in my stomach when I saw that. It clearly said that my family and other Japanese Americans were not welcome in their hometown. And I was just shocked. That's when I went home and asked my mom, and she was reluctant to have me investigate even further. But what I learned was about Hood River. And then also during World War II, a veterans group had removed the names of 16 Japanese Americans who were serving our country during World War II. And there was an honor roll on the side of the courthouse with 1,600 names. And those 16 Nisei names were removed. That brought, there should be one before that one. That's okay. We'll just go back to, yeah. That actually brought national notoriety to my hometown. But to go back and more fully answer your question, Madeline, that was the aha moment. That was the community secret that I was uncovering. My family, other community members, Japanese American, the mainstream community, no one wanted to talk about it. But that's what really propelled me to ask more questions and want to understand more.
Yeah, I'm realizing, of course, you saw the document in the library, but you really got so much of your information through oral history and interviewing people. What was that experience like? And, you know, maybe it's obvious, but why did you use that method of interviewing people to find out about people's history?
Sure. Well, first of all, there weren't a lot of written documents. As I said, there were very few books. There was just not a lot of written information. I'll also have to admit that I really disliked history. I could never find a connection. So history classes were not interesting to me either. But I wanted to go back to my grandmother, and I had her story. And she made me promise that if I wrote her life story, which I did, it would only be available to family members because she was being very private. And I learned then that there was a Japanese saying called "the nail that sticks up gets hammered down." In other words, don't make yourself look important. Don't make yourself bigger than the rest of your friends and your neighbors in your community. And so I thought, well, wait a minute. If grandma won't let me share her story, what if there are lots of nails that stick up? Maybe if I'm able to get more stories, then I could learn more I'd learn about the human experiences, and I could do more research, and then I'd get a fuller picture, and then everybody would be safe. And so that's actually what I ended up doing. I took an oral history class because I knew little about oral history, and was able to take a class from Charlie Morrissey from Baylor College, and he'd been the curator for the Truman Library. And I read voraciously about immigration in Japan and early settlement and World War II and the military. My head was full. But most of all, let you go to the next picture. I really enjoyed being able to interview community members. I didn't know a lot of them, besides my grandmother. And so my mom and dad went with me, and I introduced myself. And after a while, 13 Issei agreed to be interviewed. Again, I was reading voraciously, but I was so thrilled that they were willing to speak. And even though they were reluctant at first, you see the picture of my grandmother and Mrs. Itsu Akiyama, who is Bishop Akiyama's grandmother. Mrs. Akiyama was very typical. At the beginning of our interviews, she asked me if I would not audio tape her because she was so private. Instead, she asked that I simply take notes. After a while, she was willing to be audio taped. And then she really was such a wonderful storyteller. At several times during our interviews, she would rush out of the room and bring something back, some crochet work from camp or some pictures that she thought she wanted to share with me. And after we concluded our interviews, she told me, I enjoyed this. In fact, now I'm going to share my story with my sister, and I'm going to write her letters in Japan. And so that was wonderful to be able to hear their stories and to help them to understand that what they'd done was important, and hopefully to encourage them to share their stories with other family members as well. But certainly that helped me to get the big picture. And by the way, my uncle, the one who had encouraged me to begin oral histories and ask my grandmother questions, he'd been a military translator during World War II in the South Pacific. And so he became my translator during my interviews, and that was wonderful.
That sounds great. And you learned a lot about the Issei, and I loved that book, and I was particularly interested in the interviews of Mrs. Itsu Akiyama. And I know you may have some more information to share, particularly about the Akiyama family, but then also there, so there's the people who originally came in, as you said, in the early 1900s, and then had children who were citizens, as you've already mentioned. And then suddenly with World War II, is there more about the experience of Japanese Americans in Hood River in World War II you want to mention? You did mention the egregious act on the behalf of the American Legion, and that did, as you also said, get some national press with editorials mostly against it, as I understand, and also a few local folks who were protested that, but for the most part, it was something that was accepted. And of course, the treatment of people as they were incarcerated too. And any embellishment there you want to offer?
Sure, I can give you a little bit of a glimpse at World War II, including about the Akiyamas. I actually think the next picture was just an example of, okay, that's just great. So yes, on December 7, 1942, after Pearl Harbor was bombed, people were skeptical about Issei, thinking that they were loyal to Japan, and the Nisei, even though they had been born in this country. Immediately, the leaders of the Japanese community in the United States were deemed as suspicious. And Bishop Akiyama's grandfather, Mr. Akiyama in Hood River, was the president of the Japanese Society of Hood River. And that was basically to help others succeed. It had no connection with Japan and the Japanese government. But at 3 a.m. the next morning, the Akiyama home was searched, and the FBI and the county sheriff took Mr. Akiyama away to a jail, and then eventually to Portland, and then to Justice Department centers. Those in the United States were subject to curfews. They could only travel 5 miles from their homes. Their assets were frozen. And Mrs. Akiyama then was left to manage the orchard. One time she told me that she was able to visit her husband in Portland, which was about a 2.5, 3 hour ride one way. And she said, all I could really think of to ask him was, how do I take care of the orchard? Because she was left to make decisions about the spray, about the harvest, everything else. Next. In fact, the Akiyama's eldest son, George, had already been drafted into the military, and he was serving in the army. One day he was actually able to come home and help the family. And here's George surrounded by Mrs. Akiyama and the family when he came home on a visit. Now, the Issei in Hood River were trying to demonstrate to Charles Sprague, the governor of Oregon, that they were loyal. And 148 of them signed a pledge of loyalty and mailed it to him, saying, we love this country so much, we want to live here permanently. And we pledge our loyalty to the Stars and Stripes. And again, they wanted their children to be good American citizens. But on February 19, 1942, Executive Order 9066 was signed by President Franklin Roosevelt. By that time, more than 2,000 Issei leaders had been arrested. And on the West Coast, Western Defense Coast, Issei and Nisei were excluded because of military necessity. Even the Nisei, who were American citizens. And Lieutenant General John DeWitt had claimed that the Japanese race is an enemy race. And his rationale was a little confusing. The fact that no sabotage has taken place is a clear indication that such action will take place. On May 13, 1942, the Issei and Nisei from Hood River were uprooted. They were taken by bus to the train depot in Hood River and sent to what the government called assembly centers and then relocation camps or American concentration camps. They were among 120,000 Issei and Nisei along the West Coast who were uprooted from their homes. And 73% of them were American citizens. What's important is that there were no charges, no hearings, and no trials. But they were incarcerated simply because they had Japanese blood. They were sent to, the plan was to send them to 10 American concentration camps, but they weren't ready yet. So they were sent to mill sites, former county fairgrounds, and also animal stockyards. And you may know that one of the sites was the Portland Temporary Detention Center, which was the Expo Center. And what they did was to move the animals out and to move the people in. Nisei were serving in the military, and in February 1943, they were allowed to volunteer. As it turns out, 33,000 Japanese Americans served our country, even while many of their families were incarcerated on American soil. Some of them served, as my uncle did, in the South Pacific as linguists, translating for Japanese prisoners of war and also translating military documents. And others in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team served in Europe, and they had the highest combat casualty rate and became the most highly decorated unit in military history. I mentioned the honor roll of 1,600 names on the county courthouse, where 16 names of Nisei were removed on the evening of November 29, 1944. That brought immediate national notoriety to my hometown, something I didn't know about until I was a young adult. There were editorials from New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, San Francisco Chronicle, letters from citizens across the country, more than 300 letters from GIs overseas who wrote letters to Hood River and to the American Legion, protesting that kind of action. And then, as I say, there was a campaign in Hood River to prevent Issei and Nisei from returning home. A 1943 survey, in fact, had shown that 84% did not want Japanese to return. And this was part of a national survey, and it was 2.5 times more than those in 4 other Western states. But the tough thing for me was to notice, this was one of 6 almost full-page ads, to see the verbiage on this. In the middle, you'll see a map showing that Japanese farms were squeezing out white farmers. And in fact, my uncle's and my grandparents' property was listed on this map. On the right-hand side of this ad, which you don't see, was a list of Issei and Nisei properties. And the goal was each week to list their names in the newspaper and put a check mark by the names of those that had been sold. But the worst part for me was to see the names that were listed underneath. And in all, there were more than 1,800 names of locals who were purported to say that they did not want my parents and grandparents and other Japanese Americans to return home. And as I looked at the names, I saw names of parents and grandparents of classmates. I saw my school bus driver, and I found the name of a former junior high English teacher. And that was devastating. Again, I can still feel the pit in my stomach thinking, my gosh, how did this happen? Why didn't anyone tell me what was going on? And why didn't we learn about this in school? But we've got to do something. So that was the story from grade school until young adult, to be shocked to discover a community secret and feel helpless, but definitely wanting to know more.
This is remarkable information, and you've done a great job of sharing it. I know you're involved with some current activities. Are we ready to talk about that, or is there more? Are there more?
Oh, we were going to talk about the return home and the Akiyamas.
Sounds great. Please. Yes.
Yeah. So only 40% of the Issei and Nisei who had lived in Hood River actually returned to Hood River. And this was a big change from the 70% who returned throughout Oregon. My family was actually labeled as the first to return with a son who was serving in the military, and the Oregonian wrote an article about them as being a test case. But I'd like to talk about the Akiyamas because Mrs. Akiyama told me that when they returned, their orchard they had a caretaker, but her orchard had become 5 acres of weeds that were 5 feet tall. The apples, she told me, were full of worms. And even when they had tractors and equipment that needed to be fixed, they couldn't find anyone who would repair their vehicles for them. And yet, she told me that she found inspiration in efforts to restore the orchard. And she told me, I'm still amazed that we had such ambition. Next slide. I thought there was one of George, but actually that's George Akiyama. And he was, he had served heroically in Europe. You'll have to ask the family about his stories, but he had earned both a bronze and a silver star for his heroic efforts in Italy and in France during World War II. And when he finally came home in December 1945, he was wearing his military uniform. He got off in Hood River and he thought, well, I'll get a haircut before I head home to see my family. And he walked into a barber shop that had cut his hair before. He sat down and he wasn't served. And eventually the barber came out with a razor and swung it toward George and said, I ought to slit your throat. And George looked at him and said, you're worse than some of the Germans we fought. And he walked out. Now, it happened that Captain Sheldon Lawrence had also returned from the war, and he happened to witness what happened. He later, this was December now, he found out, he didn't know George, but he found out where he lived. He parked his car at the bottom of a hill, walked up the hill 2.5 miles in snow because it was snowing in December. And he knocked on the door and apologized to George and his family. And then he wrote a letter to the Oregonian and commented on such unjustified insults to a small group of some of the nation's best fighting men. And he criticized those who, he said, have not grown up yet. I'll also say, and I call him an unheralded hero, as there were some that we should recognize who did not succumb to the kind of prejudicial statements, but in fact supported Issei and Nisei, even when they might have suffered repercussions as well. One other comment is that Bishop Akiyama's father, Sab Akiyama, had served in coding in the military. He was younger and didn't actually serve out all of the war, but he came home too in his military uniform and stopped by a grocery store in his home area and was also denied service. I think he asked for coffee or cigarettes, and they said, oh, we don't have them. And he said, no, I see them right there. And they said, no, we're not serving Japs. So that was the kind of denial that occurred after World War II, when Issei and Nisei were coming home. They had suffered. They had spent 2.5 to 3 years away from their homes in degrading conditions, and then were not welcome home and had to sacrifice to try to bring their orchards and their farms and their livelihoods back. That was really devastating for them. And yet, as Mrs. Akiyama said, we found inspiration in our work. And that was quite amazing. One other thing I'll mention about the Akiyamas is that Mrs. Akiyama told me that when her husband was taken away and put in a justice detention camp for 18 months during the war, he wrote to her once and told her that he had been baptized, and he encouraged her to be baptized too. And so she was, and they became early founders of the Japanese Methodist Church in Hood River.
Such great stories. Well, great informative stories, I guess that's the best way to put that. So what's next on the slides? Is it now time to talk about?
I think we have a picture of, okay, that is Captain Sheldon Lawrence. I think the next one might be of Sab Akiyama. Oh, okay, yeah, we've got them a little bit mixed up, but let me talk a little bit about a tie-in with the Akiyamas, because you had asked me a little bit about that before. Bishop Akiyama's father, Dr. Sab Akiyama, became an optometrist after the war, but during the war, he studied coding at the counterintelligence school. And I was able to interview him in 2001. I found him to be particularly insightful and very open about his experiences. And in some ways, even though it's a little bit sad, he also was so much fun to interview. He told me that when he was a kid, he used to think, I wish I were white. He said that when he went to first grade, the other kids in school knew all the nursery rhymes because they'd learned them at home, but his mother and father couldn't teach him nursery rhymes. And when his classmates talked about grandpa and grandma, he didn't know his because they were living in Japan. At lunchtime, his friends brought sandwiches to eat, and his family didn't have enough money to buy bread often. And so his mother made rice balls and put a dried fish inside, and the kids would tease him. So Sab, the inimitable Sab, would chase kids with the rice balls and get back at them. He told me that when he was in 6th grade, he went to his first birthday party and they had ice cream. He said, oh my gosh, our family only had ice cream once a year. So he said, wow, I used to think I wish I were white. On the other hand, his family was so giving and so hardworking and so proud. And he kept telling them, because of our circumstances, you got to excel. He said, we were kind of the underdogs, but we learned to work hard. He also told me that growing up, Uncle Sam's word was like God's word. It was the law. And so as he got older, there was no question that he should serve as an American citizen honorably in the US forces. And his father was adamant about that. But at some point, he still felt there must be something wrong with me that the government could treat me and my family that way. He almost felt as if it were my fault that we were interviewed. And so that's one reason he told me that he wanted to volunteer for service in our American military. One thing, though, that shows that that I was very proud of. Many Issei and Nisei chose not to speak up. And even as a kid, I found that difficult because we had been taught to lay low and not create a scene. But Sab also spoke up. And the picture that you're seeing was in 2001 when Hood River dedicated the Overlook Memorial Park in downtown Hood River had bricks honoring veterans and families. And on Veterans Day in 2001, the American Legion in Hood River dedicated a brick for Nisei veterans. And at that dedication, and I was there, the commander at that time made a statement that said, imagine fighting for your adopted country against your country of origin. He meant well, but it was erroneous. And Sab, Bishop Akiyama's father, responded the next week with a letter to the Hood River News. And I'm going to find it and read it, part of it. We, the Nisei, are natural born citizens of the United States of America. This is our country, not our adopted country. Our service in the military was a fight against the Axis powers and not our country of origin. So that was an important statement that that he made, to speak out and say, hey, wait a minute, I'm an American citizen. This is not my adopted country. This is my country. And his parents felt the same way. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And we do have some questions, but I know we have some, you want to make sure that you talked about some things that are going on right now.
Oh, absolutely. Derek? Yeah, some things that happened more recently in my hometown and in our state. In 2001, the 4th of July parade selected 2 Nisei veterans as grand marshals. One was George Akiyama, and one was my uncle Mamnoji. And that was an important event. Last June on Flag Day, we dedicated, you may be aware that a forever stamp was released by the U.S. Postal Service in honor of Japanese American World War II veterans. They called it the Go for Broke stamp. We've been lobbying for about 15 years for that, and we're thrilled that the stamp was finally released, and we were able to host a dedication at the Oregon Historical Society in Portland. Carrie Timchak hosted us, and former Governor Kulongoski was also a speaker. And then we were able to pass Senate Bill 1509 to dedicate Highway 35, which extends from the Columbia River to Mount Hood, as the Oregon Nisei Veterans World War II Memorial Highway. And that happened on August 13 in Hood River. Again, the former Governor Kulongoski was there with us, and we were able to include 4 Nisei veterans and 2 Nisei veteran widows. And that was a thrill. One upcoming event, and that's this Friday on Veterans Day, Post 22 American Legion, whose former members had removed the names of the 16 Nisei veterans from the county honor roll. They'll be honoring Nisei veterans and also apologizing for that act. And so I'm going to be going up for that event as well. But what goes around comes around, and what's important is that we learn from the past, we move forward, and we really recognize the rights of all citizens I think it's a really important step that Commander Carl Casey and others are modeling, the fact that we can look back, apologize, dedicate ourselves to honoring all citizens of all races and creeds and move forward together. That's really important. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda. And that is a great example of some reconciliation that it's been a long time coming, but very important. And actually, one of the questions was, did the 16 soldiers' names get restored? I know that this event is coming up with an apology for having taken the names off. Were they ever restored to the?
Oh, good question. Yes, they were. Not immediately. It turned out that the national commander of the American Legion did request that happen. And I think it was 13 weeks after the request, those names were replaced. The interesting thing that my uncle told me was that when they replaced them, the names actually were a little bit darker and more prominent. But that was an important step. We've not been able to locate them. The memorial board has disappeared, but yes, the names were removed. Thank you for that question.
Right, good question and nice answer too. So yeah, Maureen Hagan from St. Stephen's in Portland indicated that she has a parishioner who she'd like to get interviewed. Any thoughts about the oral history process?
Oh, yeah, there are several organizations. One is the Japanese American Museum of Oregon in Portland. The possibility of having oral histories completed. Also, Densho, which is a Japanese American archival society in Seattle, has a lot of oral histories, but those would be for Japanese Americans. On the other hand, there may be other organizations. The Oregon Historical Society used to have an oral historian. I know Shauna would be an excellent resource on that. I'm thinking,
yeah,
I see her shaking her head.
Yeah, we don't. I'm the library director at the Oregon Historical Society. No, we don't have an oral historian on staff right now, but I would think that either JAMO or Densho would be excellent organizations, and JAMO's here in Portland. So
it's so wonderful to get the stories and to get them videotaped and to see to see the emotions and also to recognize that our seniors and anyone have important experiences that they can share.
Is there a way to say, because she is 95 and she says, but my story is just ordinary. There's nothing special. I had nothing, whereas the stories she heard last week were very special, but and her son really would like to do this. And do you have a good argument to give her? She's a very humble woman.
Yeah, that's exactly what I faced. Thank you so much for that question. That's exactly what I faced. They said, I'm just a poor old woman or man. I've not done anything significant in my life. There's no reason that I should be interviewed. Here's what I would suggest. I found that if you ask the senior to identify some photos, some really significant photos, or some artifacts, then they might be a vase or a special hat or something else. And that would be a wonderful starting point. Just begin asking questions and getting stories about them. And then you'll find that you're doing research to learn more about that. So you can ask better questions. And pretty soon you're beginning to have a conversation. What helps is that they understand that you're so interested, you're going out and getting information and coming back. And I would record it, certainly by audio tape, maybe by videotape on your camera. And in some cases, if people are reluctant to share, You might even ask several of them to come together and speak at one time. I did that once. I know it's a no-no in oral history, but I had one person in particular, and I was concerned that he might not be willing to be interviewed. And so we had a conversation, and the others began answering, and pretty soon all three of them were invested in sharing the story. There are some classes, I believe, that are available, and certainly probably online resources, but it is such a rich experience. One other thing I'll tell you, after I had interviewed a veteran, and he was wearing his military cap, there were framed photos and military achievements on his walls. And I asked him at the end, have you shared your stories with your families? And he turned to me and said, no, they haven't asked. And so my quest is, please ask your parents, ask your neighbors, share, ask the seniors whom you meet, invite them to share their stories, because they are important. And there's a livelihood that comes, an invigoration, also a pride in recognizing that somebody else could relate to my stories. And that's as big a reward as anything. Plus the fact that we get to learn stories that have heart and soul and are much more interesting than what we just read the data in our history books.
Right. I'd like to add, as somebody who also has done some oral history. Well, first of all, I was really struck by, in the interview with Mrs. Akiyama in your book, she was reluctant, but she finally kind of said, well, I guess I'll do this for my grandkids. And so I interviewed my parents and other family members, and kind of, helped them understand that they were doing it for me. And that sometimes helps too.
That's one of the things I've heard too, is that, that sometimes they're reluctant to share with their kids, but for grandkids, maybe there's some distance, and they're more willing to share. Absolutely.
So
whatever it takes.
Right, exactly. And Shauna has asked, what's your next goal or challenge? And obviously you're headed out to Hood River for this Friday's event in honor and really, what can I say, the veterans group making reparations really for past actions. But are there other research projects or actions that you're working on, Linda?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, actually, the Portland Sapporo Sister City organization worked to translate my grandmother's diary. It's a 5-year diary from 1946 to 1952. And I haven't really had a chance to go back and do a lot of work with that. So I'm really intrigued by that. And for a woman who was not willing to share a lot about her own life and thought she was just a poor old woman, to be able to see, to make connections with what she wrote. So that's another project coming up.
Great, good. This has been such a delight. We're all really pleased to have spent this last hour with you, and are so grateful for your sharing your time and your wealth of knowledge. I'd like to mention to the group that we're making plans for 2023 for a speaker series, and the information is in the chat, and we hope you will come. And also there's our email address if you want to contact us with any questions. Oh, I see we have one new message. Let's see. Oh, from Ford. Similar to the Oregonian, I wonder if any Hood River news publishers have formally acknowledged past acts of promoting prejudice and declared a commitment to change that practice. I think Ford is referring to the Oregonian. articles just within the last couple of weeks. Also apologizing for their racist editorials and reporting. What do you know about any Hood River publications, Linda?
Yeah, I also know that Tom Hallman is going to be coming up to our Veterans Day program on Friday, and he wrote the article on May 14th in the Oregonian. I heard today that the Columbia Gorge News in Hood River came out with some articles, an article before Veterans Day, and I haven't seen that yet. But I think they'll also be doing an article about Veterans Day. So I'm looking forward to that.
Good.
But yeah, the
Right.
Oregonian's article was really, Rob Davis spent a long time doing research and touching base with a lot of people. And the apology and the frankness of his article were really important.
That's right. Thank you again, Linda. We really appreciate listening to all that you have shared with us this evening. And
Thanks
thank
so
you
much
to
for the
all,
invitation.
of course. And with that, I think we'll say good night.